Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاشبني وجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد عاشبني وجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد راجل واحد مبدأ واحد
عاش ثورتنا
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
وسمعنا
رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش
الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال،
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И вновь продолжается бой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to The World Tonight. This evening being the 10th of January 2024, and coming to you tonight with a program about liberal utopianism and some of its works. But we won't be able to get to all its works because liberal utopianism and its service to the increasingly dystopian vision of the bourgeoisie in terms of its ability to still conduct propaganda is, of course, perhaps a show in and of itself. But tonight we're going to be talking specifically about the way in which liberals of all kinds, and I'm using the definition of liberalism as used by Stalin in his work Anarchism or Socialism, which if you've not read, you really should. Where Stalin uses the term liberalism to describe bourgeois ideology, which is, of course, completely correct. The liberal philosophy, the liberal thought that emerges from the Enlightenment period, from its earliest incarnations with perhaps people like John Locke to its later incarnations and most radical incarnations with people like Thomas Paine. Liberalism centers upon, of course, the rights and sometimes the responsibilities, but mainly the rights of the individual vis-a-vis the state, generated, of course, in response to the increasing antagonisms between the growing outdatedness of absolutism and the wish for, first of all, economic and civil freedoms and later political freedoms that is expressed by the rising bourgeoisie, as of course shown in the development of the revolutions in England and in the United States and in France as the most successful examples of this that came across in the period of the 17th and 18th centuries. So liberal utopianism, what do I mean by that? It is a reference to particular schools of thought. Mainly, it has to be said, in academia and the think tank world, who are convinced that there is a way to resolve the horrors generated by capitalism, by the imperialist system, by having a nice new set of contracts drawn up between states, principally between states. And this is, of course, a very old, particularly liberal delusion. In some ways, it predates Enlightenment liberalism because you have the attempts by people like Thomas More, when he was Henry VIII's chancellor, to come up with a system of conflict resolution in Europe. Conflict resolution being the big academic term in some international relations courses, certainly the ones I took in the early to middle period of the previous decade. Now, what this theory is based upon is the idea that states have certain interests, certain national interests, and that these are the clashes of these are, I'm simplifying this a great deal, by the way, what leads to war and conflict. And that if states, particularly the most powerful states in the world, can agree a system of binding law and contracts between each other, then the conflicts in the world can be resolved via reference to an established negotiating process. You see, if you go back to Locke and or a more radical thinker like Rousseau, or even more radical still like someone like Paine, from the earliest iteration with John Locke himself, what the liberal thought has been obsessed with, or more, I should put it more, perhaps more delicately than that, been enlivened by, is this desire for a contract of some kind. In Rousseau's case, he named a book after it, but a contract between the state and the those that the state governs. And when Locke says that, of course, he means the bourgeoisie. When later on Rousseau says it, perhaps it's a little bit more broad. I mean, Rousseau was more an inspiration for Jacobinism than he was for the more moderate elements in the bourgeois revolution in France. But a contract nonetheless. In Locke's case, this is this is animated by the experiences of England in the 17th century and the bourgeoisie wanting to limit the arbitrary power of the king. And in the end, they could only resolve that by beheading one king and overthrowing another, until finally they found a series of monarchs who were more pliable and willing to play the role of frontman, basically, for bourgeois interests and not do anything foolish like get in the way of them. But a contract in the way that bourgeois thinkers consider it is something that is holy, something that is or should be binding between rational parties who can bargain with each other and can come up to a conclusion that can be legally binding. Of course, even Locke, though, has to admit that this can be violated, and in that case, the offended party has the right to revolt. And in Rousseau's case, that's a little bit more explicit. In Paine's case, the revolt is positively celebrated. But this is where it originates from, the wish for a contract that will be rationally bargained for, whereby there will be protections for the most important things, especially that the bourgeoisie as a class values, which is, property principally, but life and liberty going along with that. But to save the bourgeoisie, to protect the bourgeoisie from the arbitrariness of the king, in particular Charles I in England, who had been arbitrarily detaining people, arbitrarily taxing people. Remember the radical bourgeois American slogan, no taxation without representation. Well, this was the power of the absolute monarchies that ruled the European countries in the up to, anyway, the 18th and early 19th centuries. So the idea being that the contract is something which helps protect you against that and gives you recourse if, again, the state violates it. And this is something that is translated into the international sphere. You've also got in the Enlightenment period, Immanuel Kant's theory of how to attain perpetual peace. And as we get into the 20th century, with the number of devastating wars growing, especially, of course, the first great imperialist war, 1914 to 18, you get after that and after World War II, bourgeois thinkers trying desperately to come up with ways to avoid the war happening again, trying to find ways to govern the relations between certainly the most powerful states in order that it can be avoided. And so after World War I, you have, of course, the great idealist Woodrow Wilson, which is always a laugh when I hear somebody use that term for him, because, of course, the man was one of the leading exponents of American imperialism in its earlier phases, and was, of course, a bitter racist who organized screenings of Birth of a Nation in the White House. Something perhaps that everybody likes to forget, him being the great genius who created the League of Nations, which of course couldn't get through Congress, so the United States wasn't actually in it. But along with the League of Nations, which unsurprisingly proved to be completely impotent, you get other things like Kellogg-Briand Pact, which I mentioned the other day, the idea that they were going to outlaw war, and even Mussolini signed up to that. And then a few years later, of course, invaded Abyssinia. So again, the bourgeoisies of the imperialist countries do understand that the wars that were being waged have devastating consequences for their class in terms of the destructive power that is unleashed there. Now, the other outbreak of this sort of utopianism, this idea that they were going to construct, maybe we should call it a rules-based international order, was of course after 1945, and you get all the even bigger delusions this time round. You get the delusions of the United Nations, you get the UN Declaration on Human Rights, which, by the way, was co-written by General Jan Smuts, one of the premiers of pre-apartheid but still deeply racialist and colonialist South Africa. And you also get, of course, things like the Nuremberg trials, which are shrouded in mythology in the West. It's frequently cited by politicians who've probably never read a single thing about them. But it should be kept in mind that, of course, many of the most guilty men in the Nazi state were kept from the hangman's noose. People like, of course, Reinhard Gehlen and many others who were middle to upper middle ranking Nazis who actually did the real dirty work. The men who got hanged at Nuremberg, the military and political and intellectual leaders, shall we say, of Nazism, they, of course, thoroughly deserved the fate that they got. But many of the worst criminals, like Gehlen and others, got away with it because they were recruited directly by the United States. But even with all the failures and also all the drawbacks of the Nuremberg process, it still had to be something that it was insisted upon principally by the Soviet Union. The British really didn't want to go ahead with it, especially with the trials of military men, because they knew very well that much of what the Nazis had done in Eastern Europe were all things that the British Empire had done over the preceding 100 years and would do again immediately after World War II. As we've covered before when discussing the work of Frantz Fanon, immediately after World War II, in this period where you get liberals, like I'll name some examples, like Professor Richard Sakwa, who's written a lot of very informative books on Russia, which I would encourage everybody to read, particularly things like The Putin Paradox. But the man's politics are a disaster zone, a liberal disaster zone. I saw him in an interview on George Zamwelli's channel called The Gaggle, where he's singing the praises of Kennedy and Gorbachev and talking about great missed opportunities for peace. And what made me laugh most of all was he says that, Gorbachev's ideas for peace were generated by this great new political thinking in the 70s, which discarded the dogma of Marxism, Leninism about the hostility of the United States. And he later had to admit in the next sentence, in fact, that, some of those ideas might have been mistaken. Now, what, of course, Sakwa and others love as liberals is this idea that if we can just construct the right system of law and contracts between states, then we can have, to use Kant's term, perpetual peace. It's a very, very bourgeois form of thought, and therefore it's no surprise that British academics, even those who are critical of the policy stance of the British government, have become hooked on this idea. So let's unpack this a little bit further. So after World War II, you get the United Nations being created, you get the UN Declaration of Human Rights, you get the Nuremberg trials, which, of course, as I said, the British were not keen on. It was the Soviets that wanted those trials. And, of course, you get a similar trial in Japan where even fewer guilty men were actually hanged, and many, many more got away with it. So the peak periods where people like Sakwa, I've seen Jeffrey Sachs go on about this as well, and others go on about, we had this great opportunity for peace, and it was just missed. But this is undoubtedly a point of view which is riven with what can only be described as imperialist chauvinism. Because let's just examine the post-1945 world. And now, as has been mentioned before we even get to the official closing point of World War II, before the Nazis have even run the white flag up the pole, we have the French colonial forces committing horrific massacres for which nobody was ever held accountable in Algeria. We have the French also committing massacres immediately after World War II in the great new bold dawn of the United Nations and the ushering in of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, solemnly read into international law, a new system of international dispute resolution, which always gets, of course, liberals very excited, is ushered in. And what happens immediately? Well, business as usual. You get a French war on Algeria, which ends up over the course of the 13 years between 45 and 58, costing 1 million Algerian lives. You have the French war in Vietnam, or Indochina as it was called then, which caused not only a gigantic amount of destruction before the French were justifiably and humiliatingly defeated at Dien Bien Phu and driven out of at least North Vietnam, but then of course you have another 20 years of American war or American aided war on North and South Vietnam until finally the Americans are driven out at the cost of, was it at least 3 million dead Vietnamese? You have the Korean War, waged as a war of aggression by US imperialism on the Koreans who simply wanted to reunite their country and gain independence, which kills at least 3 million Koreans. And so this is the great new dawn that these liberal academics are singing the praises of and weeping over and going into paroxysms of delight about the great new system of international justice that had been ushered in by the close of the Second World War. And why didn't it work? Well, it didn't work from the very second that the ink was dry on the founding documents of the United Nations and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. All of these things were immediately violated by France, Britain, the Netherlands, which waged a war of aggression to try and regain control of what's now known as Indonesia, Britain in Malaysia, then known as Malaya, and in Kenya. The French, again, I've already mentioned Algeria and Vietnam, but also killing anywhere between 40 to 200,000 people in Madagascar, and countless other colonial massacres across North and Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia in particular, as the European colonial powers tried to hang on to their pre-World War II empires, and then as the United States steps in and takes over. And in the middle of all this, of course, you've got the establishment of the State of Israel on a gigantic act, based on a gigantic act of mass murder and expulsion of a population from its homeland. So what value does any of this actually have? The answer is absolutely nothing. It's worth nothing in practical terms. It does nothing. No UN resolution has ever prevented any of the imperialist nations from doing anything. The Americans waged a brutal war of conquest in Korea and in Vietnam. And what did the United Nations do about it? The United Nations nodded through, of course, the war in Korea because the Soviet Union was abstaining or was not actually in the meeting where this UN endorsement for the Korean War was voted upon. The US waged a war on Vietnam. Where did the great liberal institution of the United Nations sit on that one? Absolutely nowhere. What did it do? What did it do when it came to the US and Belgian-inspired coup in the Congo? Now, arguably, there are those who say that the UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld was actually murdered by the US imperialists when he tried to do something within his remit about their activities in Congo. So again, you examine what this actually does in practical terms, and it's absolutely meaningless. And I say it's those who put forward this point of view are guilty of chauvinism and at worst, or just profound ignorance and stupidity at best. Because why do the colonial wars immediately after World War II, that all of these international institutions that the liberals fall down at the feet of, that failed to constrain in any way the imperialist powers, that did nothing to prevent the imperialist powers slaughtering their way through their colonial possessions to try and keep hold of them, and thankfully failing? What value is any of this stuff? Now, you might argue, oh, well, it's good to demonstrate how hypocritical the imperialist powers are. And I suppose you could say there's an argument for that. You can demonstrate to particularly a domestic audience how large the gap is between their words and their deeds. I suppose that's quite useful. But even if you're doing that, you need to make clear that there's nothing in this Charter of the United Nations, or in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, or in the powers such as they are, which is not very much, of the International Court of Justice, which is ever going to do anything to constrain the US imperialists and their allies. Now, of course, people like Sakwa and others mourn the great missed opportunity of 1989, when Gorbachev, you can see the liberals go into like absolute ecstasy when they start talking about the great missed opportunity of 1989. 1989 was not a missed opportunity. 1989 was a calculated act of capitulation by Gorbachev, who just surrendered on every single major point, to the point where George H.W. Bush and James Baker couldn't quite believe what was going on, who helped to orchestrate counter-revolutionary coups in all of the people's democracies, who destroyed the Soviet Union ultimately and caused millions of deaths. And liberals, of course, love this guy. But what happens in 1989 is not a great missed opportunity. What happens is that US imperialism sees the surrender and the capitulation of the Soviet leadership and says, well, thank you very much. We'll now take everything. Now, how else were they ever going to act? What, with great magnanimity and respect at the solemn act of self-sacrifice, but not a real self-sacrifice, of Gorbachev? No. They are, of course, going to look at that and think, right, now this is our opportunity. Now not only can we make sure that socialism is destroyed everywhere, now that its own supposed leaders have defected to the other side, but we can also make sure that even those who tried to steer a course between the old socialist and capitalist blocs are destroyed in the process. So hence the liquidation of Yugoslavia, hence the crushing of Iraq, hence the attempt to crush Syria and the very real crushing of Libya. And all of this stems from Gorbachev's capitulation. So this isn't a great missed opportunity that the liberal critics of the US allege. It was the US imperialists reading the situation according to their class interests absolutely correctly. Now, the other thing I wanted to bring in here as an example of the degeneration of certain forms of Marxism, and connected to this, is, of course, Karl Kautsky's 1914 work entitled Ultra-Imperialism. And I want to bring this in because if you read this rather short article of Kautsky's, written just before World War II, but World War One, showing clearly that he had degenerated completely on a theoretical level already before this was amply demonstrated by his appalling position on World War One, which was essentially just a more cowardly way of agreeing with the war but not saying it, or trying not to say it. So in Ultra-Imperialism, Kautsky follows on from all these liberal arguments and states that there could be a way for the big powers of the world to, again, we go back to contracts again, to bargain with each other over spheres of influence and to come to an agreement to divide the world amongst them and live in a peaceful, ultra-imperialist period where the clashes caused by imperialism would stop and capitalism would therefore stabilize itself. I'm making a very shorthand version of his argument there, but you can read the wretched article yourself. I've just posted it in the relevant chats on all the live platforms there. Now, this of course it was savaged by Lenin, but I think the crucial thing to take away from it is, if you read this essay by Kautsky, you can see in it some of the same criminal delusions that some of the people who are advocating for a multipolar world are engaging in. There are many people who are very critical of the United States, want to find some sort of way in which the US will just accept that Russia has sovereign rights, will just accept that China is going to develop, and will just sign a deal to respect these two countries and to agree a new international settlement that will govern the relations of the world. And that therefore we will reach a more peaceful outcome. This again is partly repeating the errors of Kautsky when this is said by so-called Marxists. But for the liberals, they're now engaging in probably a fifth set of delusions, after the delusions post-World War I, the delusions post-World War II, the delusion of Kennedy and Khrushchev, the delusions about 1989, and now we get delusions about the possibility of some grand new bargain between the American imperialists and the Russians and the Chinese. Now, the US imperialists are never going to just go away, unless, of course, there is a workers' revolt inside the United States which forces them backwards and forces them to into a position whereby they are threatened with losing power entirely. And at that point, you have a potential for an American revolution anyway. But the idea that they're going to sign some grand new bargain with the other great powers of the world and just respect that ignores the history of imperialism. Now, as it is on a micro level, whereby in the case of every deal ever signed between a workers' organization and an employer, the employer immediately, as soon as the ink is dry, works to undermine it and destroy it. And this also applies to the macro level, which is that every bargain imperialism ever makes, it immediately seeks to subvert it, to find ways around it, or to destroy it. Now, the US, of course, US imperialists are the kings of ripping up agreements, and they did that relentlessly all the way through the 90s and the 2000s. Why? Because they, from their point of view, correctly saw that, well, there's no need to bargain with the Russians. They surrendered to us. We can kick them around, basically. And they had to be kicked around a long time, the ruling group in the Kremlin, before they finally collectively, so people shorthand it and say, oh, Putin realized. No, it's a collective group that runs the Kremlin, and all the serious literature on this will tell you that. And the consensus moved within the ruling circles in Russia that they had to come to the realization that ultimately Gorbachev wasn't capable of coming to, and certainly Yeltsin wasn't. He was probably too drunk. That, oh, there's no bargain we can make with these people that's going to last. There's nothing that they will sign, that they will respect. And though some people think that there's going to be some sort of bargain at the end of this war in Ukraine, there isn't going to be. I'll say that now. There's not going to be a big sit down between Putin and whoever the hell's running the US, because the US imperialists will not acknowledge ever that they have suffered a defeat. They will pretend it never happened. They will hope to God that the population, or the bulk of the population, hasn't noticed the amount of money that they've spent on it. I think that might be a fool's hope on their part. But they will not be sitting down signing treaties in the new international system with the president of Russia, be it Putin or be it Medvedev or anybody else. Or will they be sitting down and acknowledging properly acknowledging the correct position that the Chinese hold over the reunification of their country. They will sit down and they will lie, as they did when Biden met Xi, and Biden said, "Hey man, look, Taiwan, no problem, man." But they will not do anything to seriously change course, because they can't. And this is the thing that, of course, liberals of all shades, because Kautsky had become a liberal by 1914, do not understand. And it's an error rooted in a misunderstanding about capitalism itself, and of course its development into imperialism, which is that the ruling class cannot stop their assaults upon the working class. They cannot stop their constant quest to, of course, expand their capital. They cannot stop their attempts to expand their market share, to engage in wild competition, which of course leads to overproduction, which leads to a glut of commodities, which leads to a crisis. And they cannot, again, stop their attacks on workers, even though their constant attacks on workers, especially in the modern era, in the modern consumer era, post 45, ultimately leads to a position where workers can't afford to buy the goods that the capitalists are selling. And one of the things that, of course, liberals don't understand is that this isn't a system which can be governed by rational means. It's a very wild system. It's a system which creates an awful lot of innovation very, very quickly, that fundamentally changed the way that human beings lived in a very, very rapid period of time. If you look at the slow evolution of human civilization in many different areas of the world over the last 10,000 years or so, or at least maybe less than that, maybe the last 3,000 years or so. You look at the capitalist period and the way in which civilizations have changed in double quick time is remarkable. Of course, Marx saw and appreciated capitalism's great ability to generate not only, of course, profit, but also generate innovations at a rate of which had not been seen before. But with it, it brings, of course, gigantic and ruinous crises, the likes of which has not truly been seen before. You get to the point where you find that you have people starving perversely because there is too much food. That's the kind of crisis that capitalism brings along with it. And to a liberal, again, of any kind, this idea doesn't make any sense, because the liberal mind is locked in this idea of, first of all, the bourgeois as the universal subject. Whether you want to, whether the liberal will admit it or not, that is what their point of view is based on. And so, because their whole philosophical system from the Enlightenment is still based on this idea of the bourgeois as the universal subject, they are still stuck in the mentality of, well, we as free contracting individuals must engage in, or we should be able to engage in, some sort of bargain on a state level even, that will lead us to a more rational position. And of course, that isn't how it works. That isn't the constant quest for capital expansion that takes place through the 19th century, which ultimately, through also the intervention of the working class, pushes the original capitalist nations in the direction of imperialism, and also in the direction of ever-escalating crises that come with the period of imperialism. The liberal still does not understand that. The liberal still thinks that wars are caused by a failure to comprehend each other. Why don't the leaders? Why doesn't? This is a common complaint from the left liberals. No, why doesn't the U.S. understand the Russian position? And this is why you should always read the more honest reactionaries. The problems between U.S. imperialism and Russia and China and Iran and name any number of other countries, or Venezuela, aren't because they don't understand each other. It's because U.S. imperialism and some of its more honest representatives understand the problem that nations which insist on any degree of sovereignty present to them, which is that to keep itself going, U.S. imperialism, of course, must constantly find new areas to not just exploit, but despoil, loot, to the point of reducing such a nation to ruin. And that's the way in which it can keep itself going, and particularly because it is in this long-lasting crisis. So to say that, oh, well, if we could just find a deal, if we could just have some set of negotiations, if we could have a new system of management of international relations, all of this will be well. This is all foolish nonsense. And it ignores the reality that this is being generated by a deep systemic crisis within the heart of US imperialism, which requires the destruction of the other largest economies in the world and the countries that are, of course, the home to them. And if you don't understand that, then you're going to be just continually and perpetually surprised by, oh, well, why is the US being aggressive? Is it because of these beastly neocons? Well, no, because the people who are called neocons are just the most, often they are the most open representatives of US imperialism. But trying to draw a line between the likes of everybody's favorite Victoria Nuland and, say, John Kerry is like trying to draw a line between, trying to draw a line through a single-celled organism. It's the same thing. They represent the same thing. One's just a little bit more open about it than the other. The other couches it in long and boring and rambling speeches about climate change these days. The other will just come out and say, we're going to overthrow this country's government because, well, we can. If anything, I prefer the more honest version. So it's not in the way that some liberals will see it as just, well, either the US has had a misunderstanding. Maybe the US is, I've seen this interpretation as well, suffering because it's been founded on a doctrine of Christian messianism. It's too messianic. It's too far gone in believing in that it has a civilizing mission. Now, some officials within the US administration, within the US state, and the British state might believe in that, but that isn't why the crisis is as it is. It is the way it is because, again, of the deep-rooted problems which stretch back almost 60 years now of US imperialism and the entire US imperialist bloc that is going down with it. So this leads, of course, to an addendum, shall we say, which is over what I wanted to say tonight, which is about the case that the South African government has submitted to the International Court of Justice regarding the accusation that they've made, correct accusation, that Israel is engaged in a genocide in Gaza. That's completely correct. Israel has engaged in genocidal activities on multiple occasions since its founding, and this is the latest one. So the South African case, of course, which quotes extensively from Israeli officials, is legally speaking, if you pay attention to things like international law, on very solid ground. Now, will it lead to a guilty judgment against Israel? Well, probably not, because, of course, the imperialists have representation on this court, and they don't want to be embarrassed. And also, if Israel is found guilty, then the legal case can be made, of course, against the US imperialists themselves, because they're the ones supplying all the weaponry. They are the ones giving the military assistance to and economic assistance to Israel that enables it to do all of this shit. And of course, Israel is a long-term US colonial project. So it's very, very unlikely that the judges on the International Court of Justice will vote for this, or at least those who are selected from the countries of the UN Security Council will vote for it, because they are, of course, well, at least three of them, the US, the British, and the French, are selected from countries who are solidly aligned with Israel. Even if David Cameron's hedging his bets a little bit, saying, well, I don't know if they're engaging in genocide, don't ask me. And so what will this do? If assuming for a moment that they're found guilty, what will it do? Well, the US was found guilty in a case brought against it in the 1980s about, I believe it was sabotaging Nicaraguan shipping. He was found guilty of terrorism by the International Court of Justice. What did that do? Absolutely nothing. The only thing you could argue that it would be good for is throwing at the US in terms of propaganda. Now, ultimately, it's not a South African or any other country's legal case to a completely discredited and useless organization such as the ICJ, which is going to make the difference here. It will, if you want to take it in this direction, yes, it will be something good to throw at your liberal friends if you get into an argument about the whys and wherefores of the conflict. But interestingly enough, the way that the Israelis apparently intend to defend themselves is by going into the court and showing this over-the-top atrocity porn that they've manufactured about October the 7th. So basically, they're not going to address the charge at all. They're almost making a tacit admission that it's correct by just going in and showing a video of like the apparently terrible crimes of Hamas on October the 7th. That will be their defense, apparently. Now, this may be, just internet talk, but it seems that this is the way they're going. They're going to say everything we've done since is justified because look what they did on October the 7th, which points to the fact that many of these people inside the Israeli government have completely lost touch with reality. But again, it doesn't matter if the ICJ finds against them, because the Israeli government, led by Netanyahu, is making the still correct judgment that as long as the US sticks with them, they can continue to do whatever they want in Gaza. Now, there is, of course, a restriction here, which is that with the naval blockade effectively applied so far by the Yemenis, that's having a severe economic impact on Israel. And with the military embarrassments that keep happening inside Gaza, where the apparently wholly inept Israeli army keeps getting ambushed and large units destroyed, tanks destroyed, large numbers of men killed and wounded, and yet these morons in the Israeli army are still doing fucking TikTok videos and like live tweeting where they are. I mean, I know that there was an argument that that social media ruined people or ruined a generation or perhaps two generations now, but certainly the Israelis seem to be the ones who are the most far gone. Imagine dying because you gave your location away because you were doing a TikTok video. I mean, that's just embarrassing. But to go back to the point, what is going to stop the Israelis, and more to the point, the US imperialists in the region, isn't going to be like judgments from any UN authority or votes against them in the UN General Assembly, rhetorically useful though that might be. What's going to do it is, of course, a changed balance of forces in the region, and that changed balance of forces is the focus of what most of the speeches of Hassan Nasrallah has focused on. And he has focused on that because he has made the correct judgment that by waging campaigns for national liberation in Lebanon, which of course is still has small areas occupied by Israel, but more to the point, there is a gigantic and ruinous US imperialist influence in Lebanon, which Hezbollah will have to find a way to remove if Lebanon is going to have any remote amount of sovereignty. But also tying this to the eviction of the US from Syria and from Iraq, and now the Iraqi government has submitted a formal request that the US occupation force leaves. We'll see how that goes. I don't think that the US will be going anywhere or intending to go anywhere in response to that. But it does, of course, take things a step forward. It does put a bit more pressure on the United States, which is that they can now be said to be in violation of a demand from a government which they themselves have called sovereign, because it arose, of course, out of their destruction of the old one. And so the fighters in Iraq from the mobilization units there are increasing the pressure on the United States. The Yemenis are increasing the pressure on the United States. The Saudis are now wavering between two sides. I saw just before starting this program that they have decided to back the South African case to the ICJ, which proves that there's no real material cost there for anybody involved. The Saudis can back it, and again, that will play well with a domestic audience, but they're still not going to do anything materially speaking. Erdogan will probably back it, but he's not cutting off Israel from the oil. It's all rhetorical so far. So what will change, what will actually stop the Israelis in their tracks will be, of course, as I said, the change of balance of forces in the region. It will be the fact that when the US imperialists finally realize that not only can they not hang on in places like Syria and Iraq, but that they can't defeat the Yemenis. Like, there are people in London, these demented, drooling, retired generals and various other think tank ghouls who think that the British and the US just need to go down there and shake their fists and launch a few sorties against those beastly Yemenis and it'll all come crashing down. But what they have, again, failed to understand is the fact that Yemen is going through a revolutionary process. And this has been hidden from many people because barely anybody has paid attention to the developments in Yemen. For a long time, I didn't, until recent years. And you look at what Ansar Allah and its coalition, because it's a coalition of forces that are unified by the idea that they are going to fully assert Yemeni sovereignty and independence against the US and its Saudi puppet, which was doing the bulk of the fighting in the war over the last 10 years, that what is being done there is essentially a renewal of the independence war that was, of course, the initially created North and South Yemen, which was subject to repeated coups run by the CIA, MI6, and their Saudi proxy. But now you have a unified Yemeni national liberation movement, and they have for many years staged these gigantic demonstrations in Sana'a, where the capital city of Yemen, where sometimes, I think the most recent one, in fact, was 2 million people came in to the city to attend a demonstration in solidarity with their brothers and sisters in Palestine. And you have these vast mobilizations which clearly show that there is a very strong revolutionary national liberation movement in Yemen, which is completely unified behind the Yemeni revolutionary government, of which Ansar Allah is, of course, the primary influence. So there's not going to be any surrender or any ability there for the US imperialists and their British underling to go in and try and throw their weight around. If they try and invade Yemen, they'll probably get severely mauled. How can they do much more than the carpet bombing job that the Saudis have already done, which, by the way, was a bombing campaign run by British and American Air Force officers operating out of a base that's specifically built for them in Saudi Arabia. So what can they do to Yemen that they haven't already done? Try and invade it? Well, I don't think that's going to work out very well. Yemen's very difficult to raid, and that holding on to Yemen didn't work out very well for the British military 60 years ago. So what, the diminished British and American militaries are going to go into Yemen to try and fight the Yemenis now? I don't see that happening. The most they're going to be able to do is launch some bombing runs and shake their fists and hope that the Yemenis get scared, but these aren't people who are frightened. Now, Putin said something interesting when this all began. He says that there are people down there who aren't afraid of anything, and it turns out that he's completely correct. The horrors that the imperialists have inflicted on the Palestinians, but also Yemen, and also the Iraqis and the Syrians, have, of course, killed millions. But what has also happened is that imperialism has now created its own gravediggers in the Middle East, that you've created fighting forces there that would chew up and spit out in not very much time at all any Western army that tried to march into Iraq to take them on, or Yemen to take them on, or try to march into Syria perhaps to save the moderate rebels. It's not going to work. They're going to lose and lose badly. So this is what will change. This is what will ultimately secure the implosion of Israel, will be the changed balance of forces in the region, the fact that the US will come under increasing pressure to withdraw from the areas that it occupies, and that the formerly stable puppet regimes will find themselves in a position where they have to cease their open collaboration with US imperialism and maybe have to evict US imperialism from their countries to satisfy popular rage, which is why, of course, the Saudis are hedging their bets when it comes to Yemen. They don't want to end up in a position where they have their oil industry bombarded with Yemeni rockets. That has happened periodically before, and the American-supplied Patriot air defense system has proven to be incapable of dealing with them. So what's actually going to change things isn't going to be legal cases or the fancy wording of lawyers or the arguments in the UN General Assembly. What will ultimately cause the defeat of the genocidal Israeli regime is the building of this region-wide national liberation movement of movements inside multiple countries that is slowly boiling the US frog in the pan. And it is ultimately that and the defeat of the US forces in the region that is going to change things. There's no great new bargain to be struck here. And ultimately, the only thing that is going to secure the end of the period of imperialism is the defeat inside the United States of the US ruling class. Until that happens, as long as the US is able to hold the continental United States together, as long as you still have, of course, over 80% of international trade is still conducted in dollars. It's gone down, but it's not collapsed as yet. As long as this ruling class and its vassals in Europe are still in existence, the world is still going to be a dangerous place. Until they are defeated internally, there will be no road to perpetual peace. And this ultimately is the final point I wanted to make tonight, which is that the liberals of all descriptions, ultimately they want to find a way to make capitalism manageable, which is ultimately what Kautsky wanted when he was writing about ultra-imperialism. He wanted to find a way to make capitalism manageable so that, I suppose he would argue, there could be a peaceful transition, a peaceful and democratic transition to socialism. The more straightforward liberals want to find a capitalism that can be stabilized by just agreeing to spheres of influence. And of course, we all know that capital, more specifically in its imperialist phase, cannot abide any restrictions. And you attempt to put any restrictions on it, it will rail against them and try to destroy them as soon as possible, which is of course why imperialism acts as it does. Again, I must emphasize the point. The only thing that finally will put an end to imperialism is the defeat of the imperialists in their own countries, their removal by the proletariat and other subordinated classes in alliance with each other. That is what will do it in the end. No legal process, no grand signing ceremonies, no great new treaties, no great declarations of intent from the rostrum at the United Nations, but the bitter struggle waged by proletarians inside the imperialist nations to remove the parasitic ruling classes there. That is what will end it. Nothing else will. Right. Let's turn to comments from the discussion forum. Let me just make sure I'm seeing all of these. There we go. Now, let's see. Where are we? So we've got Banana Bender. Hello to you. We got Martin. Good afternoon. From the USA, the land of dreams. Not quite sure what kind of dreams. This is the kingdom of nightmares, ruled over by an appropriate grotesque fossil. Carmo, good evening to you. Good evening to Morgan. And good evening to Munis. And James Graham. Frank Nakai says, hello to all comrades from the heart of Silicon Valley. Oh. People live in Silicon Valley? Bejo, good evening to you. And Peter, who says, good evening from Perfidious Albion. Unused sub says, saludos from Alicante, comrades. Klavik says, hello, and hello back to you. James Graham says, that's a great idea. Calling the rule of law and order freedom. Well, depends who you are, isn't it? It's not freedom for the proletariat, but it is freedom for the bourgeois, which is all it was ever really meant to be. They made the mistake, though, of addressing themselves in universal terms, and so the proletariat could read it and understand it and think, well, why doesn't this apply to me? Banana Bender says, a contract between the state and people, or state and everything within it, including the church and whatnot. Well, the contracts I was referring to there, I mean, in the case of John Locke and people like that, it's a contract between the state and the citizen. Now, what that means really is it's a sometimes then that's in the form of a constitution, and indeed Locke wrote a constitution for one of the original American colonies. Sometimes it's going to be a contract that is written down. Oftentimes it is going to be a contract which is theoretical and is going to be something which which is striven towards by the bourgeoisie in the Enlightenment period to try and get a series of laws in place that would protect them. But ultimately, the history of the bourgeoisie proves our point as communists correct, which is they tried to get the kings to sign all manner of deals. I mean, the British, or I should say more correctly, the English bourgeois kept trying to get Charles I to sign some kind of bargain so that he would stop taxing them without calling a parliament, that he would stop imprisoning their political leaders arbitrarily. And often Charles I would agree to it and then immediately violate it the next week or the next year. And this carried on up to the point where they, in 1649, had to reach the conclusion that, oh, we can't deal with this guy. We have to kill him. So that ultimately is what secured for the bourgeoisie a state that was, or started the process by which they would get a state that was acting more in their interests. It's the usage of force to destroy the old one, to destroy the old balance of forces and impose a new solution. Now, that took them 100 years to do. But the theory is it's a contract between the state and what they would call the citizen being the bourgeois, ultimately. Now, with regard to the church, that's a slightly different question, because the church and the state in Britain is the same thing, because we have a national religion. The church is integrated into the state. The head of the state is the head of the church, which of course was an early expression of a revolt against the feudal order, this time of course led by that good Catholic boy Henry VIII. So with regard to the church in England, it's that because the state and the church are unified, basically, that the contract between the bourgeois and the state also is a contract between them and the national religion. And the reason why Anglicanism, this is my own personal view on this, is the way that it is because it's a state church that's been constructed basically to keep itself out of the bourgeois business. There's that old phrase from, I believe it was Walter Bagehot, the 19th century British constitutionalist, who said that the British Constitution was divided between the dignified and the efficient parts. The dignified parts are being the monarchy and the church principally. So these were the ornamental parts. These were the parts that were good for official ceremonies. The efficient parts being like the civil service bureaucracy, and at that time like the House of Commons that actually got on with the business of ruling. So that's the English case. In the case of like the United States, it's a little bit different because you have the formal separation of religion and the state, and religion is taken and put in the private realm. So it's a more radical version of what the Anglo theorists were talking about, the likes of Locke were talking about. It's a more radical version of that, in that it takes religion from being a matter of state to being a matter of private conscience, or at least that's the theory. Dean says, constitutional form matters far less than the balance of class forces in determining our level of liberty. Liberals fetishize these forms, leading to all kinds of wild delusions in the UN, EU, etc. Yeah, I didn't even get to the EU properly, but that's another wild delusion that they have. Beju correctly says, without justice there can be no peace. And Banana Bender says, the ruling class embraces fascism when their backs are against the wall. Historically very true, and currently true. And Beju says, all we're told about at school are the 2 world wars, and if you're lucky, the 1 World Cup. Yeah, the teaching of history in Britain is just an incredibly bad joke. I remember that we were being taught when we were about 14 that all the conflicts in English history were all about different interpretations of the Bible. It was all about Catholic versus Protestant, and still was to this day. And this was 97, 98. Solidarity to you, Muzzle Paint, who's just dropped in. Beju says, liberals I know do not simply believe in good versus bad, just bad versus more bad, like their imperialist take on Ukraine conflict. Pure pessimism. Well, I believe some of those liberals call themselves communists, Beju, but of course you're right, they are still liberals. TikTok, a lovely gift from China. Yeah, you ever seen them? It's a bit of a meme now. Chinese TikTok versus American TikTok. Chinese TikTok, which is like strictly controlled and consists of like Chinese students doing wholesome videos about like IT projects and science projects that they're doing. Whereas like American TikTok is just depraved weirdness, basically unleashed as a very efficient weapon to exploit all the contradictions of American society, if that is indeed what it is, or it's just a happy accident. James Graham says, firms off-book and externalize all the costs of production they can. We pay the bills for their economic, social and environmental destruction so they can take profits. Very true, particularly in the parasitic era we're in now. Muzzle Paint says, I'm surprised just how difficult Yemen has turned out for the West. It is revealing the weakness of the US and the Saudis despite all the high-tech gear. Yeah, the Saudis couldn't beat them in a 10-year war, almost 10-year war. They killed a lot of people. I mean, this was basically a model of like what the Israelis would go on to do, because the Saudis, fighting with like all the technology that the US and the British could provide to them, couldn't break the will of the Yemenis to fight. And the Israelis won't break the will of the Palestinians to fight either. And now the Saudis are hesitating because they've realized that they bit off far more than they could possibly chew with the Yemenis, and would rather that the whole thing just went away now. And that's why they're not getting involved in this US task force. It's why they probably don't want the US running around blowing things up in Yemen, because it might end up with the Yemenis blowing up a lot of their oil fields anyway to sink the global oil trade in retaliation. Unused Sub says, where does US imperialism stand on Irish reunification? I heard that the CIA supported the provisional IRA. Well, I've never heard that one. There was, of course, a section of the US bourgeois that was sympathetic to the idea of Irish reunification, but they never would come out and openly undermine the position of their British ally. I think US imperialism stance on Irish reunification is, well, if it's done in a way that delivers a unified Ireland still being solidly in the US imperialist bloc, or perhaps even more so, then they're not going to say no to it. But they're not going to come out and openly undermine their closest ally at this stage. They remember the solution in the Good Friday Agreement was, in my view, a classically British solution to a conflict in a colony, which is that they take their puppets in the form of the Unionists, and they have them sign a deal with their opponents in the form of the Republican movement and say that, well, we've now got a bargain. What is that bargain? It's that the British have continued their occupation of the 6 counties in the north of Ireland for another now 27 years since that deal was signed. Or 26 years, I should say. I think it was 98 that it was signed. So what's been delivered there is something which was a win for ultimately British imperialism. Yes, it got ultimately Sinn Féin into political power in the north, and the Sinn Féin strategy is to try and win power in both the north and the south, and perhaps they can have some kind of border poll. But again, without the agreement of British imperialism, that's going to be difficult. And British imperialism still keeps those loyalists ready to pop at any point. Now, that of course is going to create problems if Sinn Féin ever wins power on both sides of the border, and British imperialism doesn't want to agree to reunification. So we'll have to see how that unfolds. But I don't think the US imperialists would necessarily have a problem with it, as long as it would deliver a stable client state, basically, as Morgan has said in the comments there. Right. The Crown equals Defender of the Faith, says James Graham. Well, exactly. They're called Defender of the Faith because essentially they took the role that the Pope played in the old Catholic Church and just gave it to the monarch. Morgan says the US sees reunification as something they could potentially gain from since NATO was formed. Well, they could gain if reunified Ireland. Let's just assume that it goes through, and that Sinn Féin's strategy pays off in that you get a unified Ireland. As Morgan states, implies in his comment there, the way in which this would be done, I think, would be that you would get the British probably insisting that some kind of NATO military presence had to be there. If not themselves, then you would end up with a more open US military presence inside a unified Ireland. It would probably be put immediately or very shortly afterwards shoved into NATO, and be subject. It would have to sign all kinds of military agreements with US imperialism and British, the fading state of British imperialism, about its participation in NATO. It would become a NATO member, I think. And Sinn Féin would probably front this up, saying, we've got a unified Ireland. Yes, we've surrendered every single bit of sovereignty that matters, but we've got flag independence, we've got flag unity, we can build on that, will be their argument. Ultimately, though, it will be a unity inside a NATO bloc that would be as useless and meaningless as the governments in the rest of the NATO bloc are. And the Irish proletariat's already finding just how atrocious the rule of the Irish bourgeoisie is in terms of its complete failure to seriously develop the economic potential of the country, having just turned it into a tax haven and a property speculation place. So, okay, 20 past 11 now, so I'm going to draw it to a close for this evening. Now, there's been a number of interesting developments very deadly developments in Ecuador, so I'm going to be looking into that tomorrow along with some other questions. So I'm going to be preparing something on that to go out at 8 p.m. tomorrow. I was a little bit late tonight because I had some other things I had to take care of, but join me for the update on Ecuador, and also some updates from the Russia-NATO war in Ukraine and whatever else has happened in the Middle East. I'll be covering this tomorrow. So thank you to everybody who has tuned in tonight. It's been a very interesting discussion as always, and thank you to everybody who's contributed to that discussion. And I will now flip you back over to your musical interlude.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the workers' state the best the world has ever seen.